part from the second part of the book, in Nicaragua, and I just wanted to explain a couple of things, which is that I don't know if any of you have ever suddenly had to join a big group of people, like a brigade is, in this book, it consists of 10 people, almost none of whom have ever met each other, and suddenly they have to work together as a team, especially under pretty stressful circumstances. And being part of a group where you don't know most people and the circumstances are difficult is kind of tough, and different people's personalities come out, and you kind of get a pretty fast glimpse of who everybody is going to be. And of course, there's always, one pain in the ass and one weak link and so forth. And this is the group, the brigade that Rachel has joined. They're supposed to spend the first 2 weeks of their time in Managua going to a language school, although it turns out that the teacher is sick and never shows up, and there actually aren't any books. But so they're just going to the language school and just trying to teach each other how to speak better Spanish. But after they finish their 2 weeks in the language school, then they get to head up towards a small town called Jalapa, which is in the war zone, and that's on the border between Honduras and Nicaragua. And that's definitely much more physically dangerous than being in Managua, which is where they start out. But there is a way that psychically it's even probably tougher for the brigade to be in Managua, where they are pretty helpless and can't really do anything. And they're just sort of watching the population being slowly destroyed by the actions of the United States. And of course, it's a pretty difficult to be in a country where you're trying to help, but you're also a member, you come from a country that is actually causing all the distress that everyone's feeling. So it's difficult. So this is about the brigade during the first 2 weeks when they're in Nicaragua, and it kind of gives you a flavor of what it feels like, and also maybe the different personalities of the brigade. By the beginning of the second week, we'd basically given up on the language school. The teacher still hadn't showed, and the 2 high school students seemed to have disappeared as well. We decided to continue attending, however, just in case the teacher recovered or the government found someone else to replace her. If not, we were determined to use the time to improve our Spanish as best we could on our own. None of us, though, would be sorry to leave when the 2 weeks were up. Learning was good, but helping out would be better. And then, unexpectedly, a government official contacted Estelle and asked if the brigade would be willing to volunteer for a couple of days at a nearby sand quarry. We'd be filling in for a group of workers who recently joined the Army. Although the work would be hot and tedious, shoveling sand into trucks headed for various construction sites, we were all eager to go. When we arrived at the quarry, we saw a huge pile of amber-colored sand, a couple of dilapidated buildings in the distance, and about 24 trucks lined up in front of the sand. Most of the trucks were at least 20 years old and looked as if they were being held together with wire and electrical tape. A couple of shirtless men in tall rubber boots approached us and told us to sit down and wait, that they expected some of the drivers to show up soon. About an hour later, 3 grumpy-looking teenagers drove up in an army jeep and climbed out. After that, we were all issued shovels and told to begin filling up the trucks. By the middle of the afternoon, we'd managed to fill 22 of them. We were tired and filthy. Although we brought hard-boiled eggs and tortillas, no one felt like eating. After a short water break, we moved on to the 23rd. As we began shoveling, a white-haired man with a clipboard and a set of keys hurried over to one of the trucks and tried to start it. The engine made a couple of dry, desperate grinding sounds, then quit altogether. The man cursed and then climbed out and marched back toward the buildings. A few minutes later, the same man and 3 others showed up, each carrying multiple sets of keys. They were all clearly upset and shouting to one another. Hopping in and out of trucks, they tried them all, but none of the engines would start, each one making the same horrible grinding sound before dying. "What's going on?" Richard asked Estelle. "I don't know," she said, "but I'll go find out." Her face was coated with dirt, like a coal miner's after a day inside the tunnels. The men were now lifting up the hoods of all the trucks and shaking their heads. Estelle and Tim walked over to join them. Finally, after examining a number of the engines, the man with the clipboard determined the trucks had been sabotaged. Estelle came over with the bad news. "Sabotaged?" Alan asked. "How?" "No one was here last night," Estelle explained. "There was a fiesta. Usually someone volunteers to stay." "Shit," Lenny sighed. "They probably just poured sand in all the engines. It would be the easiest way." He was leaning heavily on his shovel, looking more like Walter Brennan than Robert Redford. "Who would do something like that?" Tina asked, patting her eyes with a handkerchief that had once been clean, white, and dainty. "Not the Contras." "No, of course not," Susan retorted. "It must have been the 7 dwarfs." She threw her shovel to the ground. "Hey," Liz said, "we're all shocked and upset, but sarcasm won't make us feel better." Susan shrugged. "Well, it made me feel better." Richard walked over and put a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Please, Susan." She pushed his hand away. "I thought we agreed not to interfere with each other." Alan rolled his eyes and then turned back to Estelle. "If most people don't mind, I'd like to go back to the original question. Are the Contras really operating in Managua?" Estelle nodded. "Absolutely. Since the Contras look like everyone else, they can easily slip into Managua or any of the other cities. There's sabotage going on all over the country." Meanwhile, the men had begun to argue and were pointing at the buildings which seemed to shimmer in the distance. Their voices rumbled like distant thunder that might or might not be heading our way. Tim, who was standing in the middle of the group but not saying anything, kept glancing in our direction. After another few minutes, he motioned Estelle to join him. "What now?" I wondered out loud. "Nothing good," Liz murmured. When the argument was over, Tim and Estelle nodded and then walked back to us. From their careful expressions, we guessed there was more bad news, although we had no idea what it could be. In vain, we tried to brace ourselves. "Listen," Tim said. "I hate to tell you this, but the men think it would be much easier to work on the trucks if they were closer to the buildings. So it would be, much easier for them to push the trucks over there if we unloaded all the sand beforehand." "What?" Alan exploded. "You're kidding, right?" Richard asked, his shoulders slumping at the thought. Tim shook his head. "I'm afraid not." "Jesus Christ," Liz said. Veronica looked as if she might start crying. "Wait a minute, don't the trucks have some kind of lever or something that you pull to dump whatever's in them?" "Not these trucks," Lenny snapped. "I can't believe it," Alan said. "We've just wasted the entire day." Susan raised her hand as if she needed permission to speak. "Excuse me, but there's a war going on, remember? People die, bad things happen. What did you expect, Girl Scout camp?" Although part of me would have loved to hurl a fistful of sand at Susan's face, the more mature, let's cut to the chase part that had spent the last 12 years convincing thousands of clients to cop a plea when it was in their best interests, understood the simple truth. We would all rather tear each other's hair out than start shoveling again. So I picked up my shovel, held it above my head, and advanced in Susan's direction. Everyone, including Susan, looked alarmed. I stopped a couple of inches in front of her and said, "Okay, do you really want to keep pissing everyone off, or do you want to help me start unloading all this sand before it gets too dark?" No one said a word. After a long moment, Susan had the smarts to pick up her shovel and start marching toward the farthest truck. "Well, what are you waiting for?" she called over her shoulder. "The fucking sand isn't going to get unloaded by itself, is it?"